I want to talk today about Douglas Murray. Douglas Murray is a columnist for the New York Post. He's the author of a book called On Democracies and Death Cults, which is about the Israel-Palestine conflict, and he is a staunch supporter of the Israeli government in its war against Hamas and throughout the course of its destruction of Gaza. He's very critical of pro-Palestine protesters. He says they support a death cult, that is Hamas. And Douglas Murray recently appeared on the Joe Rogan Experience, where he got into a heated argument with Rogan and comedian Dave Smith. And a lot of that argument centered on the question of expertise. Murray was very critical of Smith and Rogan for speaking on subjects that they're not experts about.
Have you been to the crossing points?
No.
When were you last there at all?
I've never been.
You've never been?
Well, am I not allowed to talk about it now?
You say, I'm not a historian, but I'm going to spend my time talking about history. I'm not a journalist, but I'm going to spend my time talking about this thing. I'm not an expert on this, but I'm going to spend my time talking about this thing. It's a weird move, yeah? You say, I'm not an expert.
So what's the solution? To not talk about it?
No, it's to have more experts around.
And Rogan and Smith made the point that essentially just because someone is an expert on something doesn't mean they're right. Just because they're a comedian doesn't mean they don't have a right to speak. And they might be correct and the expert might be wrong.
Have you been there?
Right, that's a good point.
You haven't been?
By the way,
Now, for me, an interesting question in all of this is Douglas Murray actually an expert on Israel-Palestine? Does he know what he's talking about? I mean, he says that you have to go there, you have to understand the place in order to have informed opinions on it. But are his opinions informed? Are they factual? What are his arguments? What are his claims? Do they stand up? So I think it's worth not just having this theoretical debate, this hypothetical debate about who ought to be listened to, but looking very seriously at Douglas Murray, this man who presents himself as an expert on the Israel-Palestine conflict. What does he actually know? And is it in fact true? So I picked up his book, which is On Democracies and Death Cults. I got a copy of this book, and I started looking through it, and I am not an expert on the Israel-Palestine conflict, but I have read quite a bit on the Israel-Palestine conflict, and it was obvious to me immediately that Douglas Murray says a lot of things that just aren't true, and he doesn't really care about presenting this conflict in a fair way. He doesn't care about presenting the Israel-Palestine conflict as it actually is. He's really a propagandist who is trying to include every fact that is favorable to Israel, exclude every fact about the Israeli-Palestine conflict that is favorable to the Palestinians, so that whoever his readers are, and there are many because his book is now a bestseller in both the US and the UK, so that all of his readers come away with the impression that he wants to leave them with, which is that this is a good and evil struggle between the good Israelis and the bad, evil Palestinians. Now, first, it's very clear that his sourcing in this book is pretty sloppy. I actually noticed rather quickly when I went to look up a quote that he didn't have a citation for, that he'd basically just rewritten a paragraph from a New Yorker article that he didn't actually cite in his endnotes. I think that's malpractice, that's sloppy. You could argue that it's plagiarism, but whatever it is, it's not citing the sources for the places that you get your material. And worse, when he does cite his sources, oftentimes it turns out that they're not that reliable. So he has this quote that he uses as part of his overall argument that Israel is fighting a death cult. And he cites a purported quote from the Hamas official Ismail Haniyeh, which is, "Children are tools to be used against Israel. We will sacrifice them for the political support of the world." Well, where did he get this quote? Well, I turned to his endnotes, and when you go to his endnotes, you find that it's a tweet from an anonymous Twitter account called @EretzIsrael, and the tweet lists January 17th, 2017 as the date of the quote. I can't find any interview with Haniyeh from that date. I can't find any other source beyond this tweet, and evidently Douglas Murray couldn't find any source for this quote beyond this tweet because he doesn't cite an original source in Arabic or English. He just cites this tweet. Now, I think all of you who might have submitted a college term paper would know that no professor, if you cite a quote and you've got in your work cited, if you've got in your bibliography a tweet and you're using that to prove that a quote is authentic, no scholar is going to accept that you're going to get marked down for that. And so I don't know if this quote is outright fabricated, but I do know that Murray doesn't have a source for this quote, and it's pretty important because the quote is a piece of evidence. It's a strong piece of evidence that he's using to support his overall thesis of Hamas being this death cult that doesn't mind, committing suicide if they can wage war on the Jewish state. Now, another instance of this kind of sloppy citation is that Murray casually says that the leaders of Hamas, the civilian leaders of Hamas, are billionaires. That's rather commonly repeated. I see it. It's even made it into their Wikipedia entries. But when you actually look into his endnotes, he does in fact cite something here, which is the New York Post, which is a tabloid. That tabloid itself provides no evidence in the article that he cites that Hamas's leaders are billionaires, except an assertion by the Israeli government. Now, the Israeli government has been known to spread fabrications around this. The Israeli foreign minister even fabricated Forbes covers, fake Forbes covers, showing Hamas's leaders as billionaires. Now, I don't doubt that Hamas's leaders are wealthy, that they live in luxury, but whether they're billionaires is a claim you need to provide pretty strong evidence for. I would be surprised if we had that kind of evidence, considering that their finances are actually kind of shadowy. I'm open to it, but the point is that Douglas Murray doesn't provide it. And if you're going to make claims, you have to back them up. So if you're going to make the claim Hamas's leaders have become billionaires with a B, on the basis they've enriched themselves through diverting international aid, you really have to prove it, and he doesn't care about proving it. Now, there are a number of cases in the book where he says things that are actually wrong, and they've been debunked. So, for example, Murray says that when Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar was killed, proof was discovered that one of Sinwar's bodyguards worked as a teacher and was employed by the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. Now, that's false. The allegation stems from the fact that a UN teacher's passport was found near Sinwar after his death. But as the Australian Associated Press explained, the passport did not belong to Sinwar's bodyguard, but to another man who is still alive. And the Commissioner General of the Relief and Works Agency publicly refuted the claim. He said the man who was named in the passport is in fact alive. He lives in Egypt. And then the man himself made a Facebook post saying he's alive and living in Egypt and he's not a Hamas bodyguard in Gaza. Now, that's important because the reason that Murray cites this idea that one of Sinwar's bodyguards was a teacher who worked for the UN, is in part because Murray, like many supporters of Israel, is trying to discredit the UN and push this narrative that the UN has been a front for Hamas. And that has real serious human consequences. That's part of what leads to Israel's banning of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, or to its defunding. These arguments have very serious consequences because when Israel tries to portray groups that are providing humanitarian aid to Gaza as essentially fronts for Hamas or riddled with Hamas operatives, that undermines support for those organizations. And when the support for those organizations is cut, the people of Gaza, the civilians of Gaza, who are being helped by that agency, they really suffer. So Murray is pushing a falsehood here. He's pushing something that has been debunked. He hasn't acknowledged that it's been debunked. He's just put it in his book as if it's a fact. Well, I looked it up and it's not true. So he's saying things that just aren't true. Now, here's another example where he says something that just isn't true. So he claims, and this is part of another narrative of his, which is the claim that Hamas's leaders have enriched themselves while depriving the people of Gaza. So he claims that Sinwar's wife was seen clutching a luxury $32,000 handbag. And people who actually know bags said this isn't the same bag. Now that's important because this fact, this alleged fact, is being used to support the narrative that Hamas's leaders were living large while the people of Gaza were in poverty. A $32,000 handbag would be a ridiculous indulgence. But it wasn't a $32,000 handbag. As far as we know, this was some cheap knockoff handbag bought in some local market. We have no idea. The point is that Douglas Murray didn't actually look up the facts around the incident that he's discussing, right? He quoted it because it supports the Israeli narrative. It supports his preconceived ideas about the Israel-Palestine conflict. And so he believes it because it reinforces the notions that he already holds. And he cares more about pushing the pro-Israel narrative than he does about whether anything he says is true. And that is what distinguishes him from an actual expert on the conflict, which he is posing as. And his whole conversation with Joe Rogan, with Dave Smith, was about how expertise is important, how you need people who actually know what they're talking about. Well, Douglas Murray doesn't care whether what he's talking about is true.
Do
I
you
have an
talk
opinion
about
on
these things?
Which things?
All these things that we're talking about.
Some of them, yeah.
Are you an expert?
I am on some, yes.
Now, I noticed as I was reading this book plenty of other misstatements, distortions, omissions throughout it. So, for instance, he says the Palestinian Authority has insisted that no Palestinian state could have Jews in it. The one absolutely clear precondition for such a state, a Palestinian state, is that no Jews could exist within its borders. Now, he doesn't cite a source for that claim, and that turns out to be the opposite of the truth. You can even look up a Times of Israel article entitled "Palestinians Say Yes to Jews, No to Settlers in Our State." So what Palestinians have actually said about a Palestinian state is that they don't want Israeli settlements. They don't want Israeli settlers who have taken Palestinian land, who have set up outposts and built cities on their land, on Palestinian land. They want those people out. And that does not mean, and the Palestinian leaders have clarified that it doesn't mean no Jews allowed. The Prime Minister of Palestine said in 2009, the kind of state that we want to have, that we aspire to have, is one that would espouse high values of tolerance, coexistence, mutual respect, and deference to all cultures and religions, no discrimination whatsoever on any basis whatsoever. Jews, to the extent that they choose to stay and live in the state of Palestine, will enjoy those rights and certainly will not enjoy any less rights than Israeli Arabs enjoy now in the state of Israel. Now, there's something a little bit funny about that because the Palestinian Prime Minister clearly knows that Israeli Arabs don't have equal rights in the state of Israel. But Israel insists that Israeli Arabs, and Douglas Murray insists too, that Israeli Arabs do have equal rights. So they're essentially calling Israel's bluff and saying, well, we'll give you whatever rights, we'll give Jews in Palestine whatever rights you give Arabs in Israel. And in fact, one of the Palestinian negotiators said, I hope the day will come when Israelis can live freely in the state of Palestine. And said, if Netanyahu argues these positions are against Jews, we say to him that 2 Jews were elected in 2009 as members of Fatah's Revolutionary Council. And that's Ilan Halevi and Yuri Davis. They're Jews who are actually on a Palestinian Revolutionary Council. They're part of the PLO. Hanan Ashrawi of the PLO's executive committee said any person, be he Jewish, Christian, or Buddhist, will have the right to apply for Palestinian citizenship. Our basic law prohibits discrimination based on race or ethnicity. And the Palestinian Declaration of Independence in 1988 had explicitly forbidden discrimination on race, religion, or color. Now, Douglas Murray said it's a clear precondition for a Palestinian state that Jews would be banned from it. Well, obviously it's not clear, because it contradicts what a number of leading Palestinians have themselves said about the Palestinian state. Now, you can argue that, in fact, they're being dishonest. In fact, they would kick out all Jews and not just illegal settlers. But you can't say that it's clear because clearly it actually contradicts their statements. And Douglas Murray, if he was being honest, would at least have to present you with the statements, but he hides the statements. And that suggests that he's dishonest, that suggests he can't be trusted, that suggests he's not really interested in the truth. So as you go through this book, you see a number of things where if you just know anything about the conflict, you know that he's hiding stuff from you in a way that someone who was, as he presents himself, a serious journalist about the conflict, they wouldn't do this. So he says, for example, conditions in Israeli prisons used to be fairly relaxed for Palestinians. Palestinians I've spoken with who were in Israel's jails before October 7th related how they had semi-open markets where they could buy and eat chicken shawarma and other dishes. Well, actually, Israel was infamous for cutting off prisoners from contact with their families, for torturing prisoners, for sexually abusing prisoners, and holding them in conditions that violate international humanitarian and human rights conventions, including by placing children in solitary confinement, and Palestinian prisoners actually repeatedly went on hunger strikes to protest their conditions. Well, if you were being honest, you would have to present this. You would have to present all the allegations that were made about conditions facing Palestinians in Israeli prisons before October 7th. He doesn't do that. Instead, he just says, I talked to some who are fine, who said they said it was very relaxed. But there are a lot of human rights reports on this. So why aren't you citing them? Why aren't you dealing with them? If you can refute them, then refute them. But don't just bury them. Don't just pretend they don't exist. Now, turning to the case of Columbia student Mahmoud Khalil, who was arrested by ICE and who had his visa revoked by the Trump administration for what Marco Rubio said was undermining the foreign policy objectives of the United States. We've argued in Current Affairs that this is a very clear violation of the First Amendment, where you can't punish people, even people who are non-citizens, for their political speech, and the Trump administration has pretty much been open about the fact that they're punishing Mahmoud Khalil because he participated in pro-Palestine demonstrations and organizations. Now, Murray has said that he loathes Mahmoud Khalil, and that's fine. You can loathe anyone you like in this country. It's a free country. But importantly for our purposes, he's also made factual misstatements. So in a March 2025 video, Douglas Murray said,
"You might wonder what a 30-year-old's doing at Columbia University," and I've been wondering that a bit. It turns out, by the way, that this guy who was organizing these protests and leading them lived in Columbia University student accommodation, but was not actually a student. That's an odd thing in itself.
But that's not true. Mahmoud Khalil was a student. He was due to graduate in May of this year. He'd finished his coursework in December, so he wasn't doing any more coursework, but he was still in student housing because the university lets students stay in their housing through graduation. There's nothing strange about that. Douglas Murray is wrong that Khalil wasn't a student. He was a student organizer. It's also wrong that there's something fishy about Khalil being 30 years old. He was a grad student, and actually grad students, the average age is in their 30s. So he's clearly grasping at straws, just trying to impugn Mahmoud Khalil in any way that he can. And he's willing to make just factual misstatements and distortions to try and sow doubt on, what was he even doing here? As if there's something strange about a grad student organizer. You can criticize Khalil's arguments, things he said, things he's done, but it's notable that instead of doing that, Murray suggests there's something fishy about his very presence at the university. Now, sometimes Douglas Murray is just exaggerating or making statements that aren't true, and it's unclear if he knows that he's engaged in hyperbole or not. So, for example, when he was on Joe Rogan, he explained away the scale of the physical destruction in Gaza. So, over 70% of Gaza's housing was damaged or destroyed by early 2024. It was one of history's heaviest conventional bombing campaigns, destruction inflicted on Gaza comparable to the bombing of Dresden. As we know, as of this recording, Israel is banning the entry of all aid into Gaza, medical, food, which is leading the people of Gaza to starve. But Murray explained why Gaza had to be so thoroughly destroyed on Rogan.
One of the reasons why the destruction looks so bad and is so bad is because when the IDF were clearing the areas that they'd asked the civilian population to leave and were going house to house, and it isn't just stories here or stories there, it's every second or third house in Gaza that has either munitions or tunnel entrances. Every second or third house. This is not the odd case. One of the things that everybody who has been there knows is that you go into a mosque and you know there will be either rockets and or tunnel entrances. You go into a hospital and you know that there will be grenades or or tunnel entrances or dungeons or whatever.
You'd think that maybe he's being hyperbolic by saying that every second or third house is a tunnel entrance or a weapons dump, that 50% of the houses in Gaza may have maybe weapons dumps. But he says it over and over and over. And if he is engaging in hyperbole, then what does he think the real number is? Because it's less than that, so what's the real number? I mean, if the number is any less than that, if this is hyperbole, then it doesn't really explain why Israel destroyed 70% of the houses in Gaza. Now, I can't see any support for this claim. He doesn't actually include this claim in his book. There's no citation that he gives on the podcast. So he just goes around saying this stuff as an expert, but not backing it up with anything. And there's another way in which Murray operates where he gives you incredibly misleading explanations of things that leave an impression in your mind that is the opposite of what actually happened. Every time Murray makes a claim, you need to look it up, because if you look at the sources, when there are sources, you'll discover how he's misleading you. So, like, one sentence in this book is, a speaker used the platform of Colombia's protest movement to promise more massacres like October 7th. Now, you might assume from that there was a speaker at an event at one of the Colombia protesters that was promising more massacres, not just a random person who shouted something. But if you look at the video he cites, it seems someone did, in fact, shout that at pro-Israel protesters, but it was a random masked man, not a speaker using any kind of platform.
Never forget the 7th of October! That will happen! Never forget the 7th of October! Not one more time! Not 5 more times! Not 10 more times! Not 100 more times! Not 1,000 more times! Not 10,000 times!
Now, I've written an article about Douglas Murray, and I go into some other examples of ways in which his writing and his public speaking on Israel-Palestine is filled with omission, distortion, and outright error. So you can go and read that, you can go look that up, but the core thing that happens throughout his book, throughout his work, is missing information. Because he wants to portray this as a black and white conflict, as Israel's a democracy, Hamas, supported by the Palestinians, is a death cult. He says, for example, that Israel is a pluralistic, multiracial, and multicultural society, but he won't tell you that Israel's prime minister says that Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people and only them, and is not a state of all its citizens. So he withholds information that contradicts the thesis. So he'll tell you that in 2008, Operation Cast Lead in Gaza was explicitly launched by Israel in order to stop the firing of rockets, but he doesn't tell you that Israel actually broke the ceasefire that was then in place. He will tell you that the IDF are morally superior to their enemies because while Hamas revels in its atrocities, Israel only commits them reluctantly. Says that none of the soldiers he met in Israel took delight in their task, but he doesn't tell us about all the evidence showing IDF soldiers celebrating gleefully the destruction of Gaza with just as much relish as the attackers on October 7th. Or he'll tell us that Hamas, because they are a death cult, because they are so depraved, attacked an ambulance on October 7th, and he quotes an Israeli saying that no one but Hamas would fire on an ambulance. That's the most horrible thing you could do. Well, what he doesn't tell us is that Israel itself has fired on a number of marked ambulances in Gaza. And in fact, the latest attack, which did come after Murray's book was written, but in that attack, Israel killed 15 medics, crushed their ambulances, buried them all in a mass grave, and then lied about the incident. So if shooting medics and shooting up an ambulance makes you as depraved as you can be, then what does that make Israel, who has done it on a scale even greater than the incident he's talking about on October 7th? So he'll tell you the stuff that supports his thesis. He won't tell you the mountain of stuff that undercuts it. So he looks very closely at the deaths on October 7th. He writes these very moving profiles of people who died on October 7th, of eyewitnesses who were traumatized by the horrible, monstrous attack, which was obviously inexcusable. But He's not interested in Palestinian deaths, so he'll go and talk to pathologists at Israeli morgues, but he won't go talk to people who work at Palestinian morgues who are themselves faced with they're totally overwhelmed with all of the pieces of bodies that are coming in and trying to find what pieces belong to which people and which families. So Douglas Murray pays selective attention to Israel and Palestine. Israel gets his sympathy, his attention. The Palestinians really, whatever suffering they experience, they brought on themselves, even though the ultimate conflict here, the ultimate underlying conflict, is really a conflict in which Israel are the aggressors, in which Israel are stealing Palestine and annexing Palestinian land. But he portrays Israel as the victims, the Palestinians are the murderous aggressors, even though Palestinians die in much larger numbers in the conflict, even though there are horrendous war crimes committed against Palestinians, which he never discusses, and even though Palestinians are not, in fact, the aggressors in the ultimate underlying historical conflict over the land of Palestine. All of which is to say that you can't trust Douglas Murray, that this is a guy who says people who talk about a conflict should know what they're talking about, they should put in the research, they should do the work, and his evidence is shoddy. He says things that just aren't true. You cannot trust what this man says. So instead of arguing over the question, who is an expert, who has a right to speak, oh, I've been there, oh, this person's only a comedian, what we should really ask about any discussion on Israel-Palestine, time anyone says anything, we shouldn't say, who are they, what are their credentials, what's their background? What we should say is, what is the argument they're making? What is the evidence that they provide in support of it? It doesn't matter whether you've been to Israel, it matters what the proof of the claim you're making is. Because you can go to Israel and reach the totally opposite conclusion to Douglas Murray. Ta-Nehisi Coates went to Israel and he concluded, oh, this is an apartheid state. This is horrible. This reminds me of Jim Crow. But the fact that Ta-Nehisi Coates went there doesn't mean that Ta-Nehisi Coates is right. So the focus has to be on the evidence. The fact that Douglas Murray spent time there, the fact that he's posh and British and his book's a bestseller, that the Times of Israel calls it a really important book, that doesn't matter. What matters is the stuff he's saying true? And when we look, we see that Douglas Murray is a deceiver. He's not, in fact, what he presents himself as. He's not an expert on Israel-Palestine, or if he is, he's someone who uses the knowledge that he has of Israel-Palestine to manipulate people dishonestly into misunderstanding the conflict. So I really think if you actually examine Douglas Murray's book, if you actually take it apart, you'll find that it's total propaganda, and you'll find that actually Joe Rogan and Dave Smith had a pretty good point, which is that what matters is, the actual facts of the situation, not who's talking about them. Well, thanks for listening. You should check out my article on Douglas Murray's book, which is available now on Current Affairs on our website. You should also check out the beautiful print edition of Current Affairs magazine. We are a totally non-profit magazine. We survive entirely on subscriptions and donations. We have no ads, we have no paywalls. You're never going to be told at Current Affairs, oh, you've read 2 of 3 free articles. Next article, you got to pay. No, it's all free, but we need donations. We need support. We need your help. We especially need your help because Douglas Murray is kind of litigious, actually. He sued someone before who misquoted him. So I've been pretty careful going through his book, trying to make sure that I get everything right. Because if you don't get it right about Douglas Murray, the history shows that he's willing to sue you. So you got to be careful. But please support Current Affairs and all independent media. We need you. Oh, and subscribe to the Current Affairs YouTube channel. Listen to our podcast, patreon.com/current affairs, and go to currentaffairs.org/donate to donate to us, currentaffairs.org/subscribe to subscribe. Thanks so much.